So now let's move on quickly to prevention. I told you that 2.5 million people get infected each year, and we're trying hard, we're chasing to get people on therapy. The sobering news is for every person that we put on therapy globally, I don't mean in the United States, globally, 2 to 3 people get newly infected. Do the math. We're losing the numbers game in that regard. So what is the answer to that? The answer to that is prevention. And there are many modalities of prevention. They're listed on this slide. They range from behavioral modifications, use of condoms, needle exchange, prophylactic antiretroviral therapy, topical microbicides. Interestingly, circumcised men have less of a chance of getting infected than uncircumcised men. But the real critical one, historically, is vaccination. So what we do is that we look at this, as we did early on, in a classical way of vaccination, the same way as we did with therapy. But unfortunately, this metaphorically extraordinarily smart virus has eluded what we do. Historically, what do vaccines do? Vaccines are the most spectacular way to prevent disease ever imaginable. These are some of the lists of the great killers. These were the baseline number of cases per year in the 20th century. Measles, 503,000. Diphtheria, mumps, pertussis, smallpox, polio, etc. In 2006, this is the decrease in those cases because of vaccines. This is a spectacular success story. Anywhere from 96 or 89 to 100% efficacy. That's what we would love to have with HIV. Why don't we have it in 2008? And why, as you can imagine, what I'm going to tell you, what might we expect in 2025? Now, I show you this, is that these are examples of very well recognized diseases with variable degrees of morbidity and mortality. Some may remember the polio epidemics of the 1940s and early 50s, smallpox, which has now been eradicated, measles, which we still see little blips of occasionally, and influenza, which occurs every year. So I've picked out 4 of these to make one important point. And the important point is that even with those diseases that have a great deal of morbidity and mortality, ultimately the body will eliminate those infections so that smallpox will kill 15% of the people. A small fraction of people who get polio will get paralytic polio. But what the body tells us is that sooner or later, usually within days to weeks, if you survive that, you will eliminate the virus and you will be protected forever. So the body is nature is really smart. So the body has already told us that it has the equipment to control measles, smallpox, polio, and influenza. And guess what? We have very successful vaccines against them. Why? This is an influenza vaccine. When you make a vaccine, you're trying to induce an immune response against these very obvious proteins. No need to remember what their names are, but they're out there, very easy for the immune system to see. So viruses such as influenza are easily seen by the immune system. The immune system makes a natural response without a vaccine. So nature is much smarter than I am and that my colleagues are. So nature has already told us how to make an influenza vaccine. How do you do it? You get these 2 proteins, you inject them into people, they make a neutralizing antibody response, and you're protected. It's not rocket science. It's relatively easy. What about HIV? Again, in a metaphorically very cunning way, HIV, the components that evoke an immune response are hidden. Now, you don't need to know anything about this process, but it really tells you that if this is the cell and the virus comes and binds to that receptor that I showed you in a previous slide, this part here that induces very transiently, the good immune response that you want doesn't happen readily. So the body's natural response to HIV is inadequate. So if we're going to get a vaccine, we've got to do a vaccine that does better than nature does, because we can't use the natural infection model. The other thing is that when you develop a vaccine against other diseases, you have what I call a window of opportunity. With our best vaccines, you can block the virus before it reaches its target organ. Namely, there's some level of viral replication, but it is aborted before it causes disease. Let me give an example. If any of you have gotten an influenza shot this year and you were protected from influenza, that doesn't mean that when you were on an elevator or talking to people in a crowd or in a theater that somebody had influenza and they sneezed on you and the influenza virus went in you, it probably replicated a few times, didn't make you sick, but the vaccine that induced your body's immune system was able to suppress it before it actually made you noticeably sick. So you felt perfectly well, you had no idea what was going on in your body, but the vaccine-induced immunity was suppressing that influenza. A classic example of that is with polio. Polio is a disease of the nervous system. That's why people get paralytic polio. But polio enters from the gastrointestinal tract. That's the reason why they were talking about back in the 40s, stay away from swimming pools, you swallow water, it goes in, stay away from people whose saliva you can get into contact with. Because when the virus enters, it goes through multiple stages. Primary infection, it replicates. You don't feel anything because it's a disease of the nervous system. It goes to the lymph node. It replicates. No problem. It goes to the primary viremia, its central focus, it goes back down to the GI tract, and only several days later does it finally get to the central nervous system. So if your body did not block it before it got here, then you have paralytic polio, or at least some neurological issue. The beauty of the vaccine is that the vaccine only needs a couple of days to block it. So what it does, it essentially cuts it off at the pass. And when you're vaccinated against polio, even if the polio virus is replicating in you, it's not an irreparable harm because it hasn't yet gotten to the target organ that causes disease. So that's the window of opportunity. Unfortunately, giving you a lot of sobering news, unfortunately, with HIV, that establishment of the reservoir occurs very quickly, within a few days, before the body can actually eliminate it. And once it's established, remember what I told you 10 minutes ago, it integrates itself into the genome of the cell, and the immune system doesn't see it anymore.